Okay, it's time to talk about Dan Soder, because this guy is not what he seems. So if you watched my episode on Bobby Kelly, you know how he tricked Dan into leaving the bonfire by gaslighting him into thinking he was the next Michael Jackson. And to understand how this was possible, you have to go all the way back to Dan's life as a youngster. Now we all know Dan grew up loving wrestling and is incredible at voice impersonations, but few people know that before comedy, Dan himself was pursuing a career in professional wrestling. Now at the time, he only got as far as participating in local backyard matches, whose focus is more on pageantry and blood than legitimately skilled wrestling. And in this subgenre of homemade videotaped backyard wrestling, there's often characters that are more known for clowning than sincere wrestling. And this comedic over-the-top performance style is where Dan found himself flourishing. And at first, his character was the green goo that saw Dan donning a green sweatsuit, and his signature move was spitting out green goo from his mouth, pretending to vomit. But eventually, Dan teamed up with another local wrestler named the Bagel, becoming a duo known as Bagel and Soda, with the Bagel wearing a giant life-size bagel costume and Dan Soder inside a giant soda can. And these two became a crowd favorite, with the crowd often chanting Bagel and Soda and even throwing empty soda cans at them as a sign of affection. Well, it's in 1999 when a WWE scout approached the duo wanting to use them for an on-air promo. Now, this wasn't them getting asked to actually be a part of the WWE, but you can imagine it was still a big deal to these mega fans. But here's where things start to fracture. So during the filming of this WWE promo, Dan notices the Bagel passing Chris Jericho a CD off camera. And when he asks his friend what the exchange was, the Bagel denies it even occurred. And about 2 weeks after filming this WWE promo, the Bagel tells Dan he's quitting wrestling entirely, with no real explanation. Well, you can imagine this was shocking and confusing to the young Dan, who had just had his first taste of the limelight. And for a few months, Dan believed his friend would come to his senses and come back to their backyard wrestling domination. But that's when he saw it. His former wrestling partner, Lou the Bagel Bega, had a hit song on MTV. And this was of course shocking to Dan, who didn't even know his friend played music or wore fedoras. It was like he was living through a nightmare. You see, up until now, Mamba music was Dan Soder's favorite and part of his entire identity. And though Dan didn't consider himself a songwriter, he had written a song called Mambo No. 4. Now realizing his friend had not only betrayed him but stolen his entire identity, Dan was in utter shock. But that's when Dan remembered Lou had slipped Chris Jericho that burned CD. You see, this is the time period where Chris Jericho became the lead singer of the beloved band Fozzy. And as we all know, due to his band's overwhelming popularity, Chris Jericho ruled the music industry in this era. So if Chris liked your song, you were a star. There really was no other explanation for hit songs like Len's Steal My Sunshine. It was a classic Jericho jam. So now Dan realizes he's been ditched by his former best friend, Lou Bega. And this is where Dan went dark, starting with lighting his soda can costume on fire in his backyard. And while this might not sound like a big deal to you, the killing off of one's backyard wrestler character couldn't be more serious. And this is where Dan began developing the voices. And while he might use them for comedic purposes now, if you've ever seen how he tricked that journalist into believing she was talking to Dave Chappelle on Legion of Skanks, you can see a glimpse of the havoc Dan used to wreak. You see, at the time, Dan Soder was hell-bent on revenge against Lou Bega, and he developed incredible impersonation abilities with the sole goal of getting into the Bega camp and causing chaos. But along the way, he warped into a music-crushing machine. You see, he takes great pleasure in causing band breakups. And this is how he spent years practicing on his way up to Bega. If you ever wondered why such incredible bands like the X's or Stroke 9 broke up, it can all be traced back to Soder. Dan would study interviews and learn how to replicate band members' voices, then locate their phone numbers and leave hateful voicemails, pretending to be one of the band members. Well, he would routinely do this and slowly watch these bands crumble. And Dan has used his vocal replication powers to cause chaos across almost all industries. You may remember there were about 3 years in the mid-2000s where everyone wore V-neck t-shirts. If you were caught wearing a regular necked shirt, you were completely ostracized. Well, this is all from Dan pretending to be the founder of American Apparel and mandating this militant and violent V-neck t-shirt rhetoric. And he's apparently even responsible for the death of 300,000 people after impersonating a charity foundation and advising their clients to eat their their own poop based on scientific data proving it's actually great for your health. But as Dan is so impeccable at his vocal manipulations, he's never been charged. So eventually Dan, the scam man, finds himself in an audition for the MTV show Guy Code, and he finds all he had to do was change his voice and the coked up casting directors went ballistic. So Dan is now dubbed as a comedian and parlays his evil vocal abilities into less sinister arenas. And while Dan now found himself on TV and with a new career, and though Lou Bega had been irrelevant for years, he still wanted revenge. And that's why Dan ends up on the show Billions. You see, he was asked to audition for the pilot, but was on the fence to whether he would even attend this audition. But when Dan got to page 12 of the script and read that Lou Bega's song Mambo No. 5 could be heard in the background of the scene, the rage took over Soder. Dan was determined to get this role just so he could force them not to use this Lou Bega song. So Dan turns in the best performance of his life during this audition and lands the role. It's only after the 4th day of filming that he demands the Lou Bega song be stripped from the script. And they of course could have just fired him for this, but Dan didn't really care about this job anyway, so he had nothing to lose. And pretty soon, Dan was running the entire set, as everyone else was afraid of losing their jobs. Every single plot twist of the show Billions was actually dictated by Dan himself. And there's plenty more strange things about this guy, like how he was trying to get Gene Simmons killed for years by claiming he was actually Gaddafi wearing a wig, or how he's taken all the money he made from the show Billions and put it into digging to the center of the earth in search of liquid gold. But we'll have to save that for another time. Until then, Dan Soder, you're a total bitch. Okay everyone, if you're keeping up, I've been driving this giant tanker ship trying to locate New York. Unfortunately, when I rewired that weather buoy, it altered the entire global positioning system and has been causing ships to wreck into each other and capsize across the ocean. So I'm driving free of navigation. I can only hope I'm aimed at NYC, the home of comedy. Earlier today, a tone drone landed on the deck, so I had to let the cargo go to knock out this Texas attack. They'll never catch me. TB Nation, prepare the docks.